Hey everybody, this is Lauren McLeod with Mermaid Trash here in sunny South Florida, and I'm coming to you today to share with you how I prep my 3 most used mediums to pour resin on. Now, I use these 3 different mediums because I think they're probably the easiest to prep and start pouring resin on. My absolute favorite is a cradled birchwood panel, and I buy these from dickblick.com, and it is their studio wood panel. Studio wood panel, and this one has a 1.5-inch cradled side. And what I really love about the birchwood panels is that they come pre-sanded, so they're already pretty much ready to go once you get them out of the plastic or box or whatever. And they typically don't require any type of varnish, and I don't actually recommend you using any type of sealer or varnish on your prepped items for resin, just because depending on what you use, they could have a chemical reaction with the resin and you'll get bubbling and other sort of weird things happening with your resin. And I'm going to tell you what to seal it with in just a moment. For the cradled birchwood panels and for any of the other mediums that I'm prepping for resin work, my favorite tape is from 3M. It is the Scotch Blue Advanced Edge Lock. This is the best. This is the only thing that I use to tape off just about anything that I'm working on. So for the cradled birchwood panels, before I start taping, typically these really are sanded very well and they're ready to go. But what I like to do is take a little piece of sandpaper and I kind of run over the flat edges and just a little bit on top, just on the side. I don't want to sand the whole thing really. I just want to lightly kind of go over the edges and make sure that there's no little pieces of grit or anything kind of hanging out or dust or anything like that. And I'm going to do that on all 4 sides and just kind of lightly go over it again. Because they don't really need a lot of work, the birchwood panels. Again, if you get them from Blick or another art supply store, they typically come really well sanded. And the reason why you don't want to over sand a piece really past like 180 grit before you start resining is that the wood has pores. And if you sand above 180 grit, typically you're going to start closing off those pores and you're going to have problems with your resin adhering to your surface just because the harder you sand it and the higher grit that you sand it to, there's just not going to be any texture or surface or pores in the wood for the resin to hang on to. So I don't typically over sand my pieces. I only go up to 180 grit. This is 180 grit paper. And I just want to make sure that all the corners are nice and 90 degree, that there's no fraying or edging. And then really from this point, it's ready to start taping. To do that, I take my 3M, and they come in wider widths as well. This is not wide enough for the 1.5-inch profile, and I'm going to show you how to tape around it. To start, I'm going to leave about 1 inch hanging over the other side of my first corner and just push that down. What that's going to do is create an overlap when you bring the tape around so that there's no seam on the very corner, which will allow resin to bleed in and such. So I'm just going to start taping around and bringing the tape just about all the way up to the top of my piece. And without going over. You never want there to be a raised edge of your tape going over your edge of your birchwood. And I typically leave approximately just the fraction, like a hair's length between the tape and the edge of my wood. And what that does is when you pour resin and it goes over that edge, it kind of seals over. It doesn't create a lip or anything, but when I go to finish my pieces and I take the tape off, what it allows it to do is when the resin spills over, it creates just the tiniest bit of adhesion on the other side of this wood, on the flat side of the wood. And when you go to sand it, it creates enough of a lip for you to be able to sand it flat along with the panel of the wood. And I'm just gonna keep going around until I meet this other edge. Once I meet the other edge and I start wrapping around, like I said, the tape is not long enough to cover the birchwood. So what I'm gonna do is on this next pass is I'm just gonna angle that first piece down until it reaches about halfway to the corner here, down the profile of the wood. So I'm just gonna angle it and bring it down a little bit and start wrapping it around again. And it'll even out and it'll go over the edge of that wood. Bring it all the way around again until you get to that first corner that you lifted over. Tear it off, and then your piece is taped and basically ready to go. You can leave the edges of your tape out like this because when you pour resin and it spills over the sides, it'll just go straight down and there won't be any drips touching the bottom of your wood or getting stuck. You can also fold the edges down. It's not a big deal. A lot of the time my edges end up folded over because you pick up the piece and tilt it and do stuff with it while I'm doing resin. And if it has the tape pushed over on it already, I avoid kind of getting resiny fingerprints on the parts of the wood that are still exposed underneath. So basically from here, this is ready to go. I don't usually do anything further to the surface of these birch woods other than maybe painting it with a base layer for ocean pieces and other background colors and stuff like that. The paint itself seems to seal the wood enough that I don't have to do anything further to it. With the first layer of resin on birch woods, however, you can get some air bubbling from the pores, and that typically only happens to me if I overheat it. Oh, my dog shook the camera. That typically only happens if I overheat it or over torch it. And if that happens, you'll see a bit of bubbling in spots. And what I'll do is that I'll cover it, I'll leave it alone, and I'll come back in about a half hour and I'll torch it. And if I don't see any bubbles, then it gets covered and left alone. If I still see bubbling, then I'll have to come back and, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, and keep kind of babysitting it. If you're worried about bubbling, which again, I don't typically see happen with these unless you really overheat your resin, what you can do is what's called a penetrating seal coat of resin. And that is the only way that I recommend sealing anything that you pour resin on. Depending on what varnish you use and whatever you try to seal your wood with, it could have a reaction with the resin and kind of have the opposite effect of what you wanted to happen. So the only way that I recommend sealing anything that you're going to pour resin on is doing a penetrating seal coat of resin. And so what you're going to do is just mix up a little bit of resin and take a paintbrush and paint in your resin, just like you would a varnish. Nice and thin, you don't want it thick, you don't want it to pool. You're just gonna brush on a nice thin coat of resin and let that cure. And you could, when that's cured, just go over it very, very lightly with a 180 grit sandpaper and you're ready to pour. Let me set those aside because, ooh, I dropped it. Those are done. Okay, moving on. The next thing I really like to pour on, oh wait, let me show you. So when I'm done with the birchwood panels, this is how I like to finish the sides. This is the top. This is part of my Islands in the Sun series. And I really like to paint the sides a nice crisp white. And what I do when I'm done is I peel the tape with a heat gun and I sand the edges flat with a sander. But we'll get into that, how I do finish work and stuff like that in another video. MDF. So I really love MDF to pour on because it is a composite wood. It is super, super, super dense and quite heavy sometimes, more heavy than regular wood would be because it is so compressed. And other than taping it, I treat it very much like my birchwoods. Typically, when you buy MDF from a supply store or an arts and crafts store, they're already going to be really sanded. So there's really not much that you have to do to it other than lightly sanding like I did the birchwood around the edges. I tape my edges just like I do the birchwood, bringing the lip of the tape just a hair, like literally like a hair's width from the edge. And other than that, MDF typically doesn't really need any sealing. Again, if you're worried about bubbling, penetrating seal coat with resin. Brush resin really thin. You don't want it to pool. And then wash your paintbrush in alcohol, in isopropyl. I use a 91, I can't reach it. I use a 91% solution, and that will get the resin right off of most of your tools. That's how I clean most of my tools, just a little bit of resin. And that's really it. MDF is super easy to pour on, and I could walk this into my studio right now and start pouring on it, and there wouldn't be any issues. MDF is really, really great even for the beginners of beginners to start pouring resin on. So I really recommend it, and it's just so sturdy and so easy to work with. And just like the birchwood panels, when you're done, heat the tape, the edges with the heat gun and peel it slowly, sand it up a little bit, and it's done. You can paint the edges too. It's just so easy to work with. I really do recommend MDF wood as one of your first projects if you're trying to get into pouring. Last but not least is canvas. The canvas I work with is, again, from Blick. This is from their Premier series, and it's a gallery profile. I love the 1.5 inch, and it is hand splined. It has a double frame, and what they do is they tuck the canvas in between the edges of the frame, and then there's like a strip of silicone that goes around it, and it gets stuffed in there, and it's super tight. I don't know if you can hear that. It sounds like a drum, and that's how tight your canvas should be. Canvas can be tricky to work with pouring resin, and that's just because when you go to the arts and crafts store, you're typically going to see and buy canvases where the backs look like that. It's a single frame, and the canvas is just stretched over the edge and it's stapled in. These aren't really great to pour resin on, and just because they sag in the center. And anything that's really bigger than this or this piece, this is a 6x8 and this is an 8x8, really anything bigger than this, I would recommend, whether it's stapled on the back or even a splined piece like this with a double frame, I would recommend doing a flood coat of resin on the back so that you have stability. Just to prevent it from sagging. You don't want to do a beautiful layer of artwork on it and then start to see it all slowly bunching and gathering and turning into a big pool of nothing in the middle of your canvas. So the easiest way to prevent that is to do a flood coat of resin. It doesn't have to be super thick. The 1/8 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch, which is typically most resins is how thick that you can pour it, is perfect. And what you'll do is just spread it out and make sure that you tuck it in and get it up underneath the edges, and that'll create a rock hard surface for you to pour resin on. For my spline pieces, because this is what I typically work on, anything bigger than this, even with the double framed and the cradled, I would still pour probably a coat of resin on the back here, just to make sure that it doesn't sag at all, that everything is perfectly level. And for taping canvases off, my trick is to get the tape as close to that rounded edge as possible. Unlike the birchwood or the MDF panels where I leave that little bit of space, you don't want to leave any space when taping off your canvas. And the reason is you want to get the tape as close to this next side panel as you possibly can, because they're going to be soft rounded edges, but you want to get the tape as close as possible. As you pour your resin and it drips over, it will create drips, just from gravity as it hangs down. And if you get your tape close enough to the edge, the drips will go over the tape edge and settle on the underside, on the other side of the tape edge. And that is what you want. Because if you leave your tape too far away from the edge, the resin drips are going to be stuck in dry and cure right in the middle of your tape line and on the edge of the canvas. And you don't want that to happen, because when you pull your tape, you're gonna have kind of like knobby ridges on the bottom of your canvas, and those can be really hard to sand away just because it's on canvas. And if you sand too hard or just do it the wrong way, nick it the wrong way, you can tear your canvas on the back. So I recommend getting your tape edge as close to the rounded edge of the, panel side of the canvas as you possibly can. That way when you remove your drips and you remove the tape, the drips are on the tape side of your pour and not on the canvas or stuck in the middle of the tape edge. That way you get a nice smooth surface when you take your tape off. For canvases, again, they typically come gessoed, which is the canvas primer. So there's not a lot that you have to do as far as prepping canvas. A penetrating flood coat on canvas is not going to do much, but you can always do it for, giggles or whatever. But I don't typically prime, gesso, or penetrate anything. This is ready to go once the edges are taped off. To go around the edge, what I do is I take my scissors, and I'm holding it funky, but I just kind of cut it at an angle. I don't cut it at a 90-degree angle. I just kind of cut it at an angle so it matches here. When you put the next piece of tape, it'll cover over that. And that's it. Those are my 3 favorite ways to do, prep and get ready my canvas, MDF, and birchwood. My final note would be the only difference between deciding how I want to do these is MDFs typically come in fun shapes, like rounds like this and other like wood cutouts and stuff like that. So that's where you're going to see a lot of the MDF is fun little shapes and stuff like that. So know that you can pour on them, and you can sand them when you're done. So that's why I like MDF, is because they come in a lot of fun shapes and they're easy to work with. The birchwood panels I really like because they give these really nice crispy edges. They're hard and flat and 90 degree, and I don't really ever do pieces on birchwood or MDF where it flows over the edge. The only time that I do it is typically with MDF when you have these really thin little, really thin pieces. The resin will conceal that, and that's easy. That's really easy to do. But on pieces like this where it has like 3/4 of an inch or harder edges like this, you have profiled. Even if you painted this to match the top and match the water, as the resin flows over, it's just because of gravity, it's going to be more opaque on the bottom than it is at the top. Just because it's going to want to pull away from that 90-degree angle. So I like the birchwoods because they're very clean and crispy. They have the hard edges, and I typically paint them after I'm done sanding them. And the canvas I like to do when I want the edge to waterfall over. What's great about the canvas is that they don't have hard edges. These side panel edges, as you can feel it as it goes over, it's a soft edge. It's not a hard 90-degree edge like the birchwood is where it meets up. The canvas is much softer, so when you paint the sides to match and you let the resin flow over, you get a really nice consistent look, and you get the opaqueness all the way through, just because it will flow over nice and easily, and it doesn't want to pull away as much from the softer edge of the canvas, unlike the birchwood. So you're going to get that really nice consistent wraparound look for the edges when you do canvas. And that's really only the couple differences that I have when selecting what I want to pour on for a project. Do I want it to have, hard edges, just the flat top with the crispy edges, or do I want it to wrap all the way around and have that gallery look? I hope this helped you. I know I talk a lot, and if you have any questions, comments, anything that you want to ask me, do it below in the comments, and I will do my best to get back to you. I hope you all have a great day, great night, great morning, great week, wherever you are in the world, and happy pouring from me, Lauren McLeod, here at Mermaid Trash in Boca Raton, Florida. Bye.